So welcome everybody to the first session of our reading Schumpeter. We're reading the Theory of Economic Development, starting with chapter 1. This is a 4-part series, and our first series today, the first one is today. The second one will be November 21st. We'll read chapter 2. The third will be December 5th, reading chapters 3 and 4, and finally we'll conclude on December 18th, readings chapter 5 and 6. So how it's structured is that each time there'll be a discussant leader. They'll have an introduction and provide notes to you, which you all should have access to already. And it's kind of an open forum and discussion on what you've read or the chapter that you read for this time period. So today we'll just kind of limit the discussion to chapter 1 and flow from there different ideas, criticisms, and your thoughts from everybody here. So you're more than welcome and actually encouraged to speak up and participate in the ongoing discussion. Beniamino, I'm first introduced Beniamino Caligari. He is our discussant leader of the day. He studied economic sociology and analysis of complex systems at the University of Torino. He worked as a researcher in NGOs dedicated to local development in Italy and Norway, and will be defending his thesis December 4th at BI Norwegian Business School in Oslo. His thesis is on the heterodox interpretation of Schumpeterian theory, and he argues for the opportunity for integrating Schumpeterian theory in the post-Keynesian paradigm. So he will provide for us a kind of introduction to the first chapter and provide some research questions, of which or not research questions, but questions that will launch into our discussion. So please, Beniamino, take away the screen for us from me.
Thank you, Mary. And thank you for the introduction. Thank you for everyone who is here with us today. I hope you had a pleasant time reading Schumpeter. I know it can be unpleasant at times, actually, but it was pretty interesting for me to reread the first chapter. It was 1 year since I opened the Theory of Economic Development, and I found things, interesting things that I didn't notice the first time. So I hope you also had a similar experience with that. And what I want to say, first of all, is that I would like to be a sort of discussant of last resort, meaning that I would have you speaking instead of me speaking. And of course, if no one is picking up questions or moving the discussion forward, I'm very happy to do so. I can, of course, talk about Schumpeter, I think, for a very long time, since I did a thesis essentially on it. What I would like here to say at the beginning is that I was very happy when Mary had a great idea of launching this reading group. And I was less happy of being the first discussant, because the Theory of Economic Development Chapter 1 is not exactly Schumpeterian theory yet. It's more setting the stage up for Schumpeterian theory that is yet to happen, and it's going to start taking place in chapter 2 and so forth. But then after rereading it recently, I changed my mind, and I do think it is interesting to have a discussion on these assumptions and these initial concepts that are set up here, because they will be relevant for the rest of the discussion. So I think it would be very interesting to start with the very foundation of this, and discussing the issue with Mary a couple of hours ago. We were discussing about the fact that it is a nice opportunity to discuss the fundamental elements of economic theory that we often do not have the time to touch upon in our daily work. And especially, I would like to discuss 3 points, but of course I'm open to other things. I'm just suggesting that this would be quite interesting from this perspective. And the first one is the role of capital, which is discussed here. Initially, there are some initial statements from Schumpeter on on this particular economic element. Of course, there is going to be an entire chapter dedicated to the economic conceptualization of capital in Schumpeterian theory, so hold your horses for that. But still, we can already start to discuss the elimination of the neoclassical conceptualization of capital, which would make a lot of people today very happy. So I'm thinking about Mary O'Sullivan, who we had the pleasure of having the seminar in Tallinn with her, and also Joe Voxon and many, many others. Then the theory of imputation, which I would like to discuss because it is, well, not necessarily the simplest part of Schumpeterian theory, and yet it is important, and it will come up over and over again in the rest of the book, so it's better if we start to discuss it now. And finally, the theory of value. There is not a lot of space in the chapter dedicated to it, but it is relevant, and it is also something that is often left out. I just was in a seminar we organized here last week where well, the participants were discussing a lot about prices and a lot about valuations, but they had absolutely no theory of value whatsoever, and this eventually came to be a problem. I don't know exactly what is the dominant or established theory of value of neo-Schumpeterian theory, or in general of innovation studies. I don't know if there is a consensus there, and I would very much like to hear your opinion on the Schumpeterian, the theory of value used by Schumpeter, and is compared to the theory of value interpretations, that the interpretation of the theory of value that are more common today in our field or your field, if you come from other fields. Of course, it would be, I think, interesting to discuss that. So these are some of my suggestions for interesting topics, for me at least, but I think that we should keep these open. So if anyone has any suggestions on some specific topic that are outside of these three, and they would like to, launch this initial comments or initial suggestions in this direction, I think this would be a nice moment to open up and see if someone has anything to say about this or something else.
Yeah. Well, it's Danilo, and by reading the chapter, something that I found that would be interesting to talk about as well would be the role of money, because he tries to discuss it in the circular flow and explains a little bit the quantitative theory of money, but he puts he opened the space to discuss the role of credit, and so that would be my suggestion for a fourth topic.
Very good. Can anyone put the link in the chat? The link to the notes? They are already there at the beginning of the chat, but we can put them again. There you go. So yes, about the money question, is there someone that would like to pick up the suggestion about money? Otherwise, I can say something about that if there is silence in the room. All right. So on the question of money, yes, I do think the question of money is really interesting, and in fact, I consider the Schumpeterian credit theory of money quite relevant, and I discuss it quite a bit in my thesis. The reason why I didn't bring it up as the most important element for this chapter is mostly the fact that the conceptualization of money used by Schumpeter here does not have anything to do really with Schumpeterian credit theory of money. And he says so himself in the notes. He essentially says that this is a conceptualization of money that is consistent with the picture of the circular flow that I want to paint here, that we're going to use later on to discuss the process of development as a sort of comparison to this, but it is neither a realistic nor a satisfactory framework to discuss money at all. We can discuss, of course, how money is represented in the circular flow, because it is important to understand it to see later how the circular flow will be impacted by economic development. But in itself, it does not move us very much forward in the understanding of the actual Schumpeterian credit theory of money. Of course, we can discuss also that. I mean, it is linked, and I very much like the topic. But I would like to keep the discussion open to your comments and your questions first.
Let me ask a more general question. What do you think? I mean, you talk about this a little bit in your notes, but what do you think is the general purpose of this first chapter? Because as I see it now, it is a picture of a static economy, if we will, or a ongoing economy. I shouldn't say static, but in the sense that there's no, it moves on its own, but it doesn't have any of the fun stuff like, you know, shocks and crisis. It's just a picture perfect utopian economic system from the way that I see it as now. So what is the kind of goal or purpose you see of him to start off in this chapter like this?
You're absolutely right with the description. There is nothing on the fun stuff here, absolutely. And the goal is essentially, and I'm cheating because I know where he wants to go, right? Because when you read it the first time, as I said, Schumpeter does not really try to help you out, right? So you are asking this question because Schumpeter does not really tell you why it is talking so much about this circular flow. So it is a relevant question. And what he's trying to do is here is to summarize the criticism that he wrote a book about in The Nature and Essence of Economic Theory. That was his first book. And essentially showing the limitation of the, let's say, stationary economic theory or equilibrium-based economic theory of his own time. Okay. And here is presenting a picture of the economy as economic theory presents it, according to him, because this is not a pure illustration of economic theory in its own time, a bit like the Pigou economics that Keynes used as a straw man in the general theory. But it also integrates some of his particular criticism. For example, most of his contemporaries would say that, of course, there is a space for capital and interest in such stationary economy. But in the circular flow, there isn't, because Schumpeter has used a book to show that there could not be a satisfactory explanation of capital and interest and profits in a stationary economy. So it is both a purely theoretical and abstract representation and a showcase of the Schumpeterian criticism of existing economics. It's a little bit of both. So this is why my first question that I put in the reading notes for the discussion point is: the circular flow a partial description of reality or a purely abstract construct? And it is mostly the second part. But Schumpeter was leaving open the possibility that certain aspects of reality could be actually studied using the circular flow. And we can discuss if this is actually the case or not. But according to Schumpeter, it is an abstract construct that, however, might be sufficient to describe certain elements or certain real economic mechanisms, but certainly nothing fun, as you said. So all the exciting stuff cannot be studied with this.
I also should, I should have mentioned that we'll be recording the session. So just so everybody's aware that this session and discussion, it will be available later on as well, and your voice or visual, if you choose to share it, will be recorded. Just a PSA announcement. But to go back to the your point, there is no mention at all in the chapter that I read of capital at all. And so your point here is that that is to show that that's not an important aspect, at least in the kind of how or it could be discussed in time equilibrium analysis without capital. As we know it now, of the kind of neoclassical framework, capital remains an important part of it. But in his exposition, it seems there are kind of minute ways that he criticizes capital, and I will bring. And the other thing that I think about also is how does the capital controversy, which I think was pretty important during this time, plays in this chapter, or in this role, or this in what is his point in the discussion of capital controversy.
These are important points, and I would say that his own perspective is that you cannot have any working or useful or effective conceptualization even of capital in the equilibrium framework, in the economic theory based on equilibrium. This is a very strong criticism. So, and going on the neoclassical conceptualization of capital that we have today, we have an equilibrium-based theory with very much so a concept of capital. In fact, it is quite central. But as many people have through the years, right, we had several capital controversies. They have shown that this concept has a number of problems, right? And Mary O'Sullivan was calling it this Irish stew, right? And of course, Mary O'Sullivan is only one in a long list of people that have produced very good arguments against this concept. And Schumpeter is part of this tradition, part of the tradition of economic theorists that do not see the possibility of a coherent, effective, and useful concept of capital in an equilibrium-based economic theory. His position is pretty stark, and in fact, when he represents this equilibrium based economic theory, there is no capital. Not because he believes that capital is irrelevant, not at all. We will see that the capital will come back in the book, and there will be a chapter dedicated to it. Not because he thinks that capitalism is irrelevant, because which is obviously correlated to his conceptualization of capital, but because he is very, very negative on the possibility of having a meaningful conceptualization of capital in economic theory, as long as you stay in equilibrium, as long as you stay in a stationary process. So I hope I made this position a little bit clearer.
Let's dig into that a little bit deeper. So specifically, when I was trying to kind of piece together where is his criticism, which it's not explicit, right, in this case, because he's kind of showing this utopian vision of the economy, and by showing this, it shows us the flaws in the sense, okay, for us, oh wow, there's no capital. Well, there's a point to that, right, as you mentioned. So for in the case of capital, I think what is important is that he talks about time, and specifically about the issue of depreciation, which even in contemporary discussions, I mean, there's a huge literature on how do we count for depreciation rates? How do we count that? And he talks a little bit about this, I mean, only in the sense that he says that he has a whole discussion about time, but he also discusses it in terms of about this question here, like, let's see, okay, quite apart from the influence of the passing of time itself upon valuations, can what happens in the course of time establish these differences in value? And he's talking about differences of value of the pasts. So I find that is one of his important criticisms to capital itself. Are there other particular points that I missed in my first reading of this?
This is okay. First of all, to back up a second, his explicit criticism of capital is in the nature and essence of economic theory, which, by the way, he just wrote essentially 3 years before this book. And in his own, in the German sphere, it was quite well read. So Barras had read the book, he had praised the book a lot, and it was considered a big success. And it was well known. So it doesn't go again into the same arguments, essentially. So because for him, that point was established in the previous book, and now he doesn't want to remake a criticism of contemporary economic theory. He really wants to produce a new economic theory, right? So you will not find here is main problems with the concept of capital, but you don't even need to go into the Schumpeterian criticism of capital, because the neoclassical conceptualization of capital has been subject to a number of criticisms that are quite good and relevant today. So in that sense, it is interesting to know that Schumpeter positioned himself in that way, but it's not so necessary to go and learn about his own personal critique of the capital concept. Of course, if you have an interest, please do it, and I would be very happy to discuss it. But it's not so gripping. And instead on the point that you are making here, yes, it is of course obviously related to capital, but here it is essentially introducing what will be later is criticism of the existing theory of interest. Of course, the two concepts are closely connected, capital interest. So you correctly make the point that this is linked with capital, but this will be taken again. So the idea that we have some implicit reason to consider more valuable what we have today compared to what we will have in the future. And here is saying that if there is no interest, and of course, since we are trying to see what are the sources of interest, right? So we cannot assume that interest already exists, otherwise it would be circular reasoning. So if this interest does not exist in itself, does it emerge simply because we prefer the present to the future? And here is saying in the circular flow where we have certainty equivalence, there is no inherent reason for that. So he's making the point that this idea of the present is better than the future is predicated either on the pre-existence of interest or on essentially some versions of uncertainty. And in the circular flow, and this is one of the crucial characteristics of the circular flow, is the fact that there is no uncertainty whatsoever.
Hello?
Well, yeah.
So I was thinking, since you two are animating the discussion, there was this point that Beniamino actually concluded his notes with, if I can just, I don't know if you guys see the screen, but in the closing remarks, Ben, you mentioned again the theory of value, and yes. I was thinking that it's a big topic right now. A lot of people are reconsidering it. A lot of people are writing about it. Mariana Mazzucato is going to publish a book on it in March. And yes. In order also to animate the discussion with the people who just joined now, I was thinking, who actually deals with value theory or mentions value in their PhD thesis or in their master thesis? Who is studying that? Like, also for the purpose of YScience is a way of knowing what people on the same non-mainstream framework are doing so far. So maybe we have 19 people in the discussion. Maybe some of you could tell us if you actually deal with the theory of value and how we can compare with what actually Schumpeter said and with value creation and so on. So for instance, me, I don't deal with theory of value, and as such, I would be very interested on the take that other young scholars have and on the comparison perspective. So feel free, you 19 people, to just say something about it.
Well, the theory of value has scared one of us away.
Yeah, I heard that actually. Either that or me. Like, I prefer to that it was a theory of value than me.
Well, that's more scary.
But
Ben, I have a question, but it's not about value right now. It's more about, he mentioned at some times the role of savings, but he doesn't say anything about investments. because actually capital, he doesn't talk about capital. But in the circular flow, as far as I remember from the readings I had, that actually they consider the investments and the quantitative improvements or growth, quantitative improvements in the production,
Right.
not qualitative ones, as Schumpeter is going to discuss in the next chapters.
Mm-hmm.
So why do you think he doesn't mention that? He doesn't go to the topic of investments?
Yes, that is indeed an important question. Why doesn't do that? Well, first of all, in the readings, you're absolutely correct, because there are other Schumpeterian rendition of the circular flow, and perhaps those that are found in the Business Cycles, 1939, in which it actually integrates this saving and quantitative growth dimension. That here, however, it is absent. It will be discussed a little bit later, but it is more part of the business cycles. Now, why it isn't present? Essentially for simplification reasons. Schumpeter does not consider quantitative growth as a very important nor challenging element. So economic growth for Schumpeter is not interesting, which is in itself an interesting statement. Why does he think that? Because if we have economic growth in the conceptualization of his times, which is this the economy that grows like a tree, right? So you have the Cruzonian economic growth, purely quantitative, right? So, essentially, the quality of the economy stays the same, but there are more people doing and producing and consuming more stuff and keeping all the proportions exactly the same. That to him can be explained with a simple extension of the of equilibrium theory, essentially. And therefore, he says this is one of the examples that where economic theory, such as it is, works perfectly well, as long as we assume that the qualitative dimension of the economy stays exactly the same through time. Then we can apply the existing theory, such as it is, and get good results or decent enough results. It didn't have any problem with that. Of course, his entire point was that this is not how market economies or in general economic systems grow, in the sense that the quantitative expansion is not the relevant factor, is the qualitative change, right? So here it is abstracting from that, because from his own perspective, from his own view, it doesn't add any significant dimension to the problem and to the discussion. So in the interest of simplification, it doesn't bring anything here, because this is a theoretical book. Then, as he says in the prelude, then in Business Cycles, which is instead a theoretical and an empirical book, then he needs to explain that data, he needs to apply this to actual empirical examples, and then he bring in this quantitative expansion. Did I answer your question somehow?
Yeah, yes. Just that I found it a little bit weird that he didn't mention it. So, but yeah. I mean, he just probably didn't want to change the focus of his argument. So it seems like a good.
It is true that it is weird that it doesn't mention. Again, I think it's a little bit of the problem that I was discussing, that it really does not help you. So Schumpeter is not here to help the reader. The reader has to go through all of it and then reflect a lot about it, and then and only then try to ask a question about what's going on, because otherwise the system does not work, because Schumpeter does not explain why he doesn't do this. So this is not explicit at all. This is a problem with the Schumpeterian style and Schumpeterian exposition that did not make reading Schumpeter any easy.
Speaking of difficult things, can we talk about imputation?
Yeah, sure.
Because I mean, for me, it's a bit complex, and I have a different interpretations of it. I'm not sure how to resolve that. But I guess I'd like to hear from you, and if anybody else had any thoughts on imputation as well, their reading of what imputation was, please feel free to come in. But yeah, please tell me what you're reading of, and then maybe I can
sure.
tell you mine.
I need to start then. Okay. Okay. So this imputation problem, essentially, it will actually be important. The theory of imputation will actually be important also to understand the consequences of innovation. So it is something that that needs to be discussed. And from this perspective, it is very much related to his theory of value. And in this case, it is at the bridge between the theory of value and the evaluations of economic entities, essentially. And therefore, how it is useful to understand from a theoretical perspective what is relevant and what is not. In particular, here the theory of imputation is deployed to eliminate or against, in a sense, the neoclassical conceptualization of capital. So he says the ultimate production factors are labor services and nature services, right? Which corresponds to labor and land. And we cannot break down these sources of production services any further. He says there are some people that consider labor a good, so labor is in a sense produced because we produce human beings by giving food to people, and then people tend to spawn other people and so forth. But he goes against that. He explicitly goes against this conceptualization of humans. So therefore, you end up with both nature and labor as the ultimate source of production. Everything else can be broken down into these components. But what does this mean? It means here an application of the theory of perfect competition, essentially. And the fact that every, let's say, mean of production, every produced mean of production, it is produced with a combination of other means of productions and labor and nature. And ultimately, you can find the first order mean of production that is created out of nature and labor. And there is no economic value in that mean of production because those who control labor and the nature, that is land, they are able to extract all the value for themselves. In this case, the exchange value for themselves. And therefore, the fact that you have this mean of production does not really give you any economic advantage, does not lead you to generating and to attract any net income, because you need to pay for it in full, essentially. So this is the use to which the theory of imputation is put at work here, and it is based on a very strong assumption of certainty equivalence plus perfect competition. It goes a little bit more in detail later, and also in other works on the theory of imputation. Tells you, well, but what about those situations in which there is a mean of production and services, the controller of services of labor and services of land do not manage to extract all the value? Okay, so what about those situations where having a mean of production actually allow you to extract net income? Aren't those situations common? And therefore, shouldn't we consider this means of production another factor of production? And he says no, because since under different economic configurations, the same mean of production would not give you any economic advantage. It is not the mean of production itself, but is the monopolistic element that is connected to the specific mean of production that is giving you an economic advantage. And therefore, if we want to introduce these considerations, we should consider these monopoly positions, or oligopolistic position, these market power positions. So it's market power that can give you a rent, not the mean of production in itself. It seems like a fine point, but on these fine points, the neoclassical theory of capital was rejected by Schumpeter. So, yeah.
So, I mean, this could be a direct criticism to Marx, no? I mean, like, he kind of slightly criticizes. I mean, Marx would possibly say, would probably say that it's the owners of the means of production that extract surplus value, right?
Yep.
Where in his case, he's saying no, it's market power, right? So I mean, I see throughout this there was a few kind of criticisms to Marx, but at the same time, he seems to be using Marx's theory of value, not perfectly, because of course Marx only thinks of labor completely as the extraction of value. The labor is the source of all value, but here he puts this twist to say no, it's labor and land. So it's this like Ricardian Marxian twist to the theory of value, which is quite different and importantly different.
Mm-hmm. I think there is a lot to say for your position, and the fact that Schumpeter has been called a conservative Marx by many commentators clearly points to the fact that this interpretation has a lot for it, going for it. But I would still argue that here there is a difference. Again, it seems like a slight point, but this is what economic theory is made of. Essentially, that there is a separation between the idea of source of production, the ultimate source of production, and the theory of value. So Marx had a labor theory of value, a refined theory of value, a social theory of a social labor theory of value, and so forth. And that's a very interesting discussion in itself. But here, Schumpeter has a theory of value that is much closer to what might be called a neoclassical theory of value, because it is psychic evaluations of satisfaction. That's the ultimate source of value, right? And he discussed this at the very end. Now, does this make Schumpeter inconsistent with Marx? Well, not so much, because once we accept that the power of exploitation, in Marx's terms, of the workers come from the monopolistic position instead of the mean of production itself, well, the fact of exploitation does not change. So you can reproduce the same situation of exploitation in Schumpeterian terms, right? So that thing remains. But once you discuss on the theory of value, values for Schumpeter are purely individual, and therefore are based on psychic individual evaluation, and therefore they are difficult to make consistent with the social labor theory of value that was proposed by Marx. On the theory of value point, I see more differences than similarities, but on the overall picture of, for example, the distribution of income, you can see a lot of similarities there.
I mean, he briefly mentions this. Well, he talks about like the social value system or social values at the end, at the last part of chapter 1.
Yeah.
And so this is where it's this kind of, I mean, trying to relate economic relations to social relations, right? So the totality of the economic relations constitute the economic system, just as the totality of social relations constitute societies. So he has some mixture, okay, and these values are interrelated similarly with the values within the individuals of the economy. So it's this. What I see is this kind of mixture of the psychic evaluation, right? How individuals value the economy, or individuals value goods, which he talks a lot about in when he discusses money, but also mixing it in, trying to embed it in the economic structure as a whole.
Yes, absolutely. And if I may add a sentence of those that you pinpointed, there is something that I think is quite important to provide some clarity to this discussion of the social and the individual. And he says, if one may not speak of social values, so one may not speak of social values, there is yet a social value system, a social system of individual values. Now, Schumpeter is very pedantic, but what he's saying here is that values are individual, but this does not mean that there is no social system of individual values. Okay, so saying social values might actually be incorrect, but there is a social value system, and this is really what and bringing this forward was, according to Schumpeter, the greatest credit of Varras. Okay, so Varras was, according to Schumpeter, the economist who showed this point better than anyone else. So in the history of economic analysis, he really praises Varras for showing exactly this fact, which is very important in Schumpeterian theory, and is going to be necessary to understand the actual impact of innovation. So this point is really important. And what does this mean that there is a social system of individual value? It is referring to mainly in operationalization of the theory in the price system. Okay, so the price system, prices are social elements in the sense that there is one price. And one price for the entire socioeconomic system under analysis. But to this one price of this particular good corresponds a multitude of individual values. So people value, of course, as we know, goods in a different way. We like chocolate, we don't like chocolate, and everything in the middle. But the price of that particular chocolate bar is exactly the same. So in that sense, the price is an expression, or the sediment here, of the social value system. And therefore is a social element, but the valuations are individual, and this element is going to be crucial for understanding what innovation means for Schumpeter and how innovation come to be, because this social value system is going to become both the enemy of the entrepreneur, or anyway the entrepreneurial mechanism, and is most precious ally, right? So it's going to go against the entrepreneur at the beginning, but then it is going to make the entrepreneur rich. So there is this interesting contrast here, and it is introduced only at the very end of, in explicit terms, only at the very end. There are some theory of value considerations sparse across the chapter, but it's only at the end that it really comes out.
Well, speaking of entrepreneurs, I mean, well, innovation, as we know, it has not been introduced yet. But he makes one sentence about an entrepreneur, which he tries to distinct. Where I think this is an important part, at least maybe because I study a lot of Marx, but is because he makes a distinction between calling the manager or owner of business an entrepreneur to one that is a capitalist. And at least that distinction, I think, was an important highlight. Probably moving forward, we will find out. But understanding that differentiates. So he would be an entrepreneur without special function and without income of special kind. And if the possessors of produce means of production were called capitalists, then they could only be producers, differing in nothing from other products, and could no more than the others sell their products above the cost given by the total wages and rents. So he makes an introduction to this and hints at it, but doesn't really quite fully develop it. I assume we're going to talk more about this in the later chapters, but if you could maybe comment on that.
Yeah, and again, this is one of the examples of the failure of Schumpeter to make itself clear, because here it is mostly introduced in these terms to show that they cannot be meaningfully described, conceptualized, discussed through these equilibrium lenses. Okay, so it's showing that in the circular flow, that it's essentially how he sees equilibrium or stationary economic theory. There are no real entrepreneurs, right? We can call these managers or owners of businesses entrepreneurs, but the entrepreneurs have absolutely no special function, so they don't do anything special, and they don't have any special income. Okay, so they are not a distributional category, and they are not really needed for the system to function, because, as it is discussing before, there are no meaningful decisions to be taken. Okay, so this is a position that he shares entirely with Frank Knight, that's saying under condition of certainty or certainty equivalence, well, there are no real decisions to be taken. It's all about calculation. and decisions imply alternatives that might be meaningful. And once you can calculate everything, there is no problem. There are no alternatives. You just maximize, and then you go with the best, with the optimal solution. So what decision is there to be taken? And here is when he discusses the situation of the owner of the firm in this circular flow, he says it doesn't do anything. It's just take the existing prices and takes the existing conditions, and then he just take the only position available to him. In a sense, here we find an echo of the Lazonic's criticism of the neoclassical firm, right? And therefore, here he's saying entrepreneur, but he's saying entrepreneur only to say, if you want to call it entrepreneur, you can go ahead, but it is completely useless. It doesn't have any specific function. And here, what he's actually saying is that in this framework, there is no meaning to the word entrepreneur. Okay, so and he's also criticizing Varaz, because Varaz is using this entrepreneur as an ni benefice ni perte, and he says this is not useful for economic analysis. And the same point is made on capitalists. Again, not because capitalists are irrelevant. They are going to be very relevant when we move forward. But again, we don't have capitalism in this system. So strangely enough, as we know, the neoclassical economic theory does not really feature a role for capitalism. You don't require the word capitalism to explain neoclassical economic theory. And there are no real capitalists in the neoclassical economic theory. And here is making the same point. Yeah, we can call the possessors of the produced means of productions capitalists, but they are no different from any other producer. So if you have a farmer that is farming his own land, so he's applying his labor services to the nature services of his land plot, well, it's going to be identical to in this model, in this theory, to any other producer. There is no significant differences, and there is no space for this very concept. So this is why there is only a single reference, right? Because we don't need to discuss neither entrepreneurs nor capitalists to discuss stationary economic theory, which for him is a condemnation, an indictment of stationary economic theory.
Hi. Oh. Sorry, can I ask?
Yeah, sure.
Something? Yes, please. I'm Carmen. So yeah, but that is a little bit strange after analyzing, reading, and hearing the discussion that you have presented. Is well, then everything is based on the inexistence of uncertainty. So without uncertainty, we don't have money, we don't have investment, we don't have capitalists, and we don't have entrepreneurs. So it's that really the case? Because probably I'm misunderstanding everything. So what do you think?
I think. Wait, just a second, Yinli. After we give an answer to this, I would very much like to hear your question. All right. So coming back to you, Carmen. I think you are right in the sense that here Schumpeter's position and is very close to Frank Knight's position, saying that essentially and the main assumption here that is clouding everything, that is making money irrelevant, is taking away the entrepreneurial aspect, is taking away capitalism, and of course also capital in interest, is the certainty equivalence assumption. Right, and I agree entirely with what you said. Only keep in mind that this is 1911. Okay, and here is making a criticism. Schumpeter is making a criticism that is very close to what, for example, Davidson, but just to say one prominent post-Keynesian, have been saying very much in the last 30 years. Only he was saying the same things in 1911, and this point is usually not discussed. I was just before coming here. Actually, I was reading this fantastic book from Alessandro Vercelli, who actually wants an integration between Schumpeter and Schumpeterian Keynesian theory, and he says the only problem of Schumpeter is that it doesn't consider uncertainty. And I was shocked, because here we have the first chapter of his most famous book. So if you read anything from Schumpeter, you read this. and you can easily see that the whole point is, hey, with this equilibrium-based theory, we don't have uncertainty, and therefore we lack everything that matters. So I agree with you.
Yeah.
And did I?
You had a question? Sorry.
Yeah. No problem.
Yeah, I would like to, Ben, I would like to talk a little bit. I think going back to Mary's previous question, here's something about, I think it's about sort of the role of business owner, manager, or entrepreneur. So you're saying there's no entrepreneur in this in his criticism or in this circular of economic life, but he does talk about business owner earning a kind of quasi rent, right? If I remember correctly. Yes. And how do you explain that? And well, in this framework, and also, I think this is also related to he's talking about directing labor, right? Directing labor to me sounds like much more like a kind of talking about some certain managerial roles or something. So well, I'm kind of trying to figure out what he's really trying to talking about in this context, the directing labor, and then the rents to manager, kind of business owner. So what is exactly what he's talking about here?
Yeah. Okay, if you don't mind, I would like to start with the second question, then we go to the first.
Sure.
If it's okay for you.
Sure.
And thank you very much for the questions. I really like both of them. And I would like to start by saying that essentially his point here is that under these stationary conditions, again, directing labor does not really involve any decision from let's call it entrepreneur, or we call the business owner, or the firm, if you want to take a impersonal stance. And if you recall traditional and the common neoclassical theory, basic neoclassical theory, then there is no dimension of direction of labor, right? The firm simply take existing prices, then resolve its maximization problem, and then it decides how much labor services are required, and therefore buy the labor services at the given prices, right? And then simply also technologies are given. So of course, so there is no direction in any sense whatsoever, right? And then labor services are performed and output is created. So in this sense, it is saying that that there is no role, because there is no dimension of decisions. There is no dimension of agency. Actually, there is no agency here, and there is also no clear dimension of power involved. Is this somehow an answer to your second question before we go to the first?
You explain what it is not, but we don't still know what it is, right? And I think it's
yes, because here you don't have Schumpeterian theory yet, essentially, in the first chapter, right? So it is coming later, and there are the famous parts about the role of leadership. In economic theory and economic development, and the role of leadership is then is going to be a big discussion about this direction of labor and what does this mean, and what are the consequences for the distributional consequences for labor income, but also what this means for the social relationship between the managerial position and the labor position.
Okay, I'll wait.
Yeah, I'm sorry to say, but this is the sad story, and this is why I was initially unhappy about chapter 1, because there is no Schumpeterian theory yet. So we need to discuss the prelude, but it's necessary, and it gives rise to useful discussion. So that's good. Going to the quasi rents.
and motivate us to read the later parts.
Yeah, exactly. Although I'm selling you something that you have not seen yet, so it is more difficult. But I hope you stay motivated. So the quasi-rents, yes, and the quasi-rent is interesting because it shows actually an application of that uncertainty thing that we were discussed before, right? Because the quasi-rents actually appear because there has been a change in the data, right? So if you want to take a look at the text, is on page 49 for the digital version that we have distributed around. So it's discussing about the spontaneous changes in data, right? With which the individual is accustomed to reckon. And it says that this creates, when they change, this creates new situations, adaptations to which require time, right? And therefore there is no immediate adaptation. If there was immediate adaptation, okay, and therefore there were essentially no possibility of exogenous change at all because adaptations would be instantaneous, then there would be no quasi-rents. Okay, so in the most perfect example of the circular flow, where there is complete certainty and everything adapts instantaneously, there are no quasi-rents. And the quasi-rents appear and accumulate. Well, not accumulate because they tend to disappear over time, but they go toward these special owners of services because of this problem between the change conditions and the inertia in the information. Okay, so this is why they appear, but they are not in contradiction with the rest of the system, but they're simply an initial application of this. It is only when there is a gap between the social system of information, and therefore the social system of prices, and the actual conditions, then these quasi-rents appear.
I see. Thanks.
So the only part of where uncertainty exists in the system, in some senses, that is asymmetric information. Is that correct to say, or no?
Well, in this case, the fact is, asymmetric information, there is someone with, okay, there is a different set of information. And in this case, there might not even be. In the sense that there might be a change in the condition that is not reflected in the information system at all. But de facto, then there is an agent receiving more than that agent expected. So okay. Eventually it gives rise to an information asymmetry situation, of course, because the agent learn from this, and other agents might not immediately. So there is an information asymmetry situation developing in the process of closing this gap. But at the beginning, this is just an example of an exogenous shock. Okay, in the most neoclassical, or if you want Lucas sense of the term, so something that no one knows anything about. Simply someone comes to be on the winning side and someone comes to be on the losing side. And the information asymmetry problem then develops later. But here, the information asymmetry is not really discussed so much. It's mostly that the system does not have instantaneous adaptation.
Ben, I have a question about the notion of equilibrium in Schumpeter in the first chapter, because I don't see, at least he doesn't explicitly make any difference between short run and long run. So it seems, for me at least, when I was reading, that there is no short run, it's always long run, it's always in the equilibrium position. So you don't have adjustment mechanisms. Maybe I'm demanding too much, like I'm trying to reach Schumpeter with the mind that I have today. So do you feel the same way, like that you don't see the role of adjustment in the process? And the second question, that I would like to ask you is that do you think it's like too anachronic to feel very weird that he doesn't mention the role of government at all in the circular flow?
Well, again, thanks for the questions. And on the first part, Schumpeter always, I don't think I ever caught Schumpeter actually using this short run, long run distinction in his own work. In discussing other people's works, yes, because his problem with this distinction is that essentially the short run, long run distinction is one in which in the short run we keep most variables, most parameters fixed, most variables fixed, right? They don't change. And in the long run they do. Now its problem was how actually these variables change, right? And what are the processes, the endogenous processes through which these variables change. So for him, it would be complicated to discuss economic matters from a short run, long run dichotomous perspective. And here, in this first chapter, in which the circular flow is discussed, there is absolutely no discussion of that because it's completely stationary, right? So we can say that there is no significant difference between the short run and the long run. Nothing changes. That's it. And it's not that nothing changes because we are considering a arbitrary short run period. We are considering only 3 months or 1 week or some other arbitrary passage of time. But we are actually considering a system where things do not change at all. Or to be even more precise, as will be also specified later, all changes are actually already taken into account in the information system. So they are already reflected in the information system. But this is something that will come up much later. So I shouldn't discuss it now. And the second question, there is no government. Yes, there is absolutely no government. And this thing will not get better. This is actually one of the flaws of the entire Schumpeterian system. It does discuss government. I think he wrote brilliant things about government, in fact, but they are not part of his economic theory at all. There is some discussion in certain articles about how governmental policy could be used to mitigate crisis. And there's also very interesting articles actually praising the post Second World War governmental performance in dealing with the economic situation, praising the intervention, the results. It is quite interesting because you don't expect this interventionist position from the Schumpeter, the stereotypical Schumpeter. But in his economic theory, in his theory of innovation, there is no role for government. This will not get better. This is not one of the things where I say, but you see, wait and see. No, this will never get better. This is a problem.
Is it partly because, I mean, he begins with, is it partly how he views like different sciences or even classes, different disciplines? So, because he starts in the beginning saying that we have accomplished what we as economists are capable of in the case in question, and we must give place to other disciplines. So I don't know if it's partly because he's like, I'm an economist and I think of things in the economic realm, and the realm of government is in politics, and that's a separate phenomenon, and that's a separate entity out of economics. So kind of the separation, maybe some history of economic thought guys can chime in here, but the separation of politics or from political economy. So it's no longer political economy, it's politics and economics. Is it partly that he lives in this realm of which these are distinct features, and that's why he doesn't include government, unlike Keynes, as we know.
Well, Marx has a theory of the state building from. I said Marx has a theory of state building on his economic theory, so I think it's a choice that Schumpeter made. Well, that's just my opinion.
Marx was at the era of political economy, right? So Marx was a discussion of political economy was one sphere. So Smith and Marx and all the classical guys were always discussing political economy. But then when we start getting into Keynes and Schumpeter, those, and even the utilitarian theorists, that they separate the realms of politics and economics from each other.
If I can say something on that, I would say, having read Schumpeter, and again, there is no explicit role for government in the economic theory proper, so it's up to interpretation, right? My interpretation, based on what he says and how he discusses things in his more methodological articles and passages that you can find in the History of Economic Analysis, but also in Business Cycles, he does not think that there is a complete separation. What he thinks is that there is a possibility, a way, and it is legitimate and potentially useful to have a purely economic research avenue. So just studying the economic phenomena is in separation, as you said. But this does not mean that the results are sufficient. He says that, but this will lead only to limited and results that will be insufficient to explain reality. So it's not that, oh, we can just study the economic phenomena and then these political things are separate. So this essentially is the neoclassical position coming from the Lucas critique, right? Saying, oh, we consider only economic matters, but this is a feature, not a bug, because we are able to explain everything by using very few data points. Schumpeter is not saying that at all. He's always saying, as you can study economics and it makes sense, it has its own legitimacy, it is useful, but then you are going to end up always with something that is insufficient to explain anything real. Okay. If you then want to move from academia to the explanation of the real world, then you need to integrate all the other dimensions. There is no way around that. Okay, so it is a very, and he was okay with that because he did not have very big ambitions. He wanted to be a good academic. He didn't want to have any policy recommendation, although so yeah, he tried to avoid that very much. And he didn't want to have certainly a policy agenda like Keynes did. And for this, Schumpeter was heavily criticized, for example, by Minsky, saying that he was detached and he didn't care about the problems of his fellow men. And to a certain extent, it was true. But keep in mind, not to say that the state doesn't matter, only to say that you have to integrate these dimensions. He doesn't, but you have to. So at least he's open and positive to that. Sorry, there are several.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, Mary. It's just that I see several questions, interesting things in the chat, and I wanted to give an opportunity for Danilo and B. Calzada to speak.
Well, if Bea wants to talk before, but well, if not, I'll make this question that because you put here in the discussion points, is Schumpeterian statement consistent with neo-Schumpeterian theory? I mean, not necessarily about this statement, but if we consider the role of government in the neo-Schumpeterian theory as such an important aspect of the discussion nowadays, if you see Mazzucato, so that would generate a big challenge in to merge, or at least to try to use Schumpeter as the main theoretical basis for the new Schumpeterian theory.
Yeah, I would say, of course, this challenge is not perceived because the original Schumpeterian theory is, let's say, on the side, and neo-Schumpeterian theories theorists do well by themselves, right? So I never heard a lot of discussion about the fact that in Schumpeter there is no role for the state. Not a lot of it, at least. So okay.
Point to Danilo's point. What?
There is a. Sorry, guys. There is only B. Calzada that want to say, and he or she doesn't have a microphone, and saying that Beatrix. Okay, Beatrix does not have a microphone, and she says that that is a good question. Schumpeter said that you have to keep digging until you find the non-economic causes, which I find a bit weird, right? So this statement that Beatrix is referring to is at the very beginning of the chapter. So essentially saying that the problem of the pure economist, right, is to find a non-economic causal force. And once you find the non-economic causal force, the work of the economist is done. Okay, and then we must give place to other disciplines. Now, again, this is more a sort of humble position, in the sense that, first of all, please give a role to other disciplines when you hit non-economic elements, instead of progressing, applying the same methods to everything, which is please do not do the imperialistic thing that economic science is doing nowadays. So please stop. And the second, again, is the fact that the economic problem might very well be solved, but still you might have no explanation, no useful explanation of the phenomenon you were trying to explain. So it is important to understand that this embraces a partial view of what economics can actually do and can actually perform and produce. They can produce pure economic explanations of phenomena, and in themselves, most of the time, these explanations will not be sufficient. And you will need to have you will need to collaborate with other people. You will need to bring in the sociologists, and you will have to bring in the legal scholars. You will have to bring in the anthropologists. You will have to bring in the other people. Would it not be also an attempt to, sorry?
No, sorry. So what you're discussing at the end is that Schumpeter was more a positivist rather than a normativist perspective on the economic realm, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly not a normativist. He really tried hard to avoid that position. So yes. There is also another question from Beatrix. I'm reading. Oh, okay, I get it. So would it not be an attempt to keep economics separated from the politics realm? Yes, actually, yes. And this builds in his own perception of what a scholar should be. So for Schumpeter, at least what he tried to be, he should be a pure scholar, a pure academic. Meaning that if you have a political life, keep it separate. It seems to be very close by to the idea of value neutrality that we have in academia today, or pretend value neutrality. But in fact, it is again a little bit more complex. Why he has this interesting paper on ideology. And what he says is that, in fact, we need ideology, and that we can, while ideology might create problems in scientific endeavors, without ideology, we might not progress at all. Okay. So what he's saying is that we actually, like Keynes, economics is not really isolated from other disciplines, not from the inside. So there is a difference between how you perform and the value parts of it, in a sense, and how you perform. Economics should be not at least aimed directly at policy recommendations. So the idea is you don't develop a theory in order to support a policy recommendation, but for developing a theory, you need for actually developing new theories, you will always rely on your ideological orientation and your ideological position, and there is nothing wrong with that in itself, as long as you use ideology to serve science rather than use science to serve ideology, perhaps. A strong, yeah. Danilo, you want to take that?
Yeah, it's just thanks, Ben. It's something that I was thinking about, because it seems like there are some similarities. We try to avoid them, but it seems there's something of the Austrian school in Schumpeter. I'd like to ask your opinion. I mean, if you see that as well, or is it something like?
Well, I have to say I don't have a qualified opinion because I have read very little from the Austrian school, so my opinion does not matter that much. Not that it matters particularly in other fields, but here I don't claim any relevance. But I would say that it is close in certain statements, but very different in others. And my gut feeling is, if I find Schumpeter grouped in the Austrian school, I would definitely say that there is something wrong with that statement. Let's put it like that. But I would defer to an expert in Austrian theory to actually tell me how things are.
Thank you. Yeah, it's just that something that came to my mind. I saw many similarities, but I mean, we're talking about this first chapter yet, so it's still hard to.
Again, it's a prelude to Schumpeterian theory, essentially.
Yes, sure. Thank you.
I tried.
So how, I mean, Danilo mentioned this point earlier, and I'll bring it up now, is how can we combine this with neo-Schumpeterians who have a strong claim to industrial policies often, or technological policies, but yet Schumpeter himself made, encouraged this kind of, but not really, it seems debatable, but how can we connect this to neo-Schumpeterians today in their work? Is this the right step forward? Is this kind of what we should be moving towards, or?
Is this what we should move forward? Well, according to Schumpeter, no. Schumpeter said there is no worse thing, the idea of having some Schumpeterians in the future. He really was against the idea of a school, and he would never have wanted this. No, the discussion of his books, yes. Schumpeterians, no. Maybe going this direction is not necessarily what we need to do. But I do think that Schumpeter, well, of course, I am a sort of a Schumpeter fan, right? So I am biased in that direction. I would say, yes, Schumpeter provides better theoretical ground to understand innovation. But even if you disagree with that, and I'm fine with any opposite position to that, I would say that there is a point that everyone maybe could take from Schumpeter, and that is the need for theory. So Mazzucato has said in Edinburgh that the new book will finally have a theory of value, and I think that is a very welcome development. And I think that this sort of development, this idea that we should perhaps integrate more theoretical elements in innovation studies and in the neo-Schumpeterian school in general, is a welcome development. And I think it is something that you find when you go into Schumpeter. Essentially, this book is entirely 100% a theoretical book, and it is a very a long-range theoretical book. It really tries to touch on almost everything. So this idea that innovation is not just an empirical phenomenon or an empirical process, and we try to record and look how it works, and then try to see what are its consequences, which often is the way in which we approach innovation. But instead, innovation is part of a larger alternative economic theory. Well, that is the second approach might be more relevant for people searching for a new paradigm of economic theory, right? The fact that Schumpeter actually provides a paradigm, and the neo-Schumpeterians, by and large, and here, of course, it is a generic statement, so you will disagree with that, but I would say that they provide very interesting topics, a collection of very interesting concepts, mechanisms, studies, and so forth, but not a paradigm, not as such. And maybe we can look at least at what the Schumpeterian paradigm looks like, and then saying, okay, we don't like that, but we might try to do something that is a paradigm just like this, but with different content. And I think that would be already a very good development.
Well, let me link this back to a question that you brought forward, the second question, just to kind of hone in this part again about the difference between Schumpeterian and neo-Schumpeterian theory, which is, you quote, okay, economic logic prevails over the technological. Is the Schumpeterian statement consistent with neo-Schumpeterian theory?
Is it? You remember Mark that was saying that at the end of the day, I mean, we can, instead of innovation, we can say technology, right? And it's the same thing. And
yeah.
Yeah,
It's just replace.
Yeah. I think Schumpeter is very explicit and very consistent in showing that that this is not the case, right? And you will see a lot of things coming in the next chapters. You will not see technology coming in the next chapters. Technology will remain a little bit in the background. It will not be completely ignored. There will be references to technology, especially in the examples, but technology will not become a very significant theoretical element. Capital will become one, and interest certainly, and capitalists, not only that, and banks, but not technology, not so much. This is a very big difference, because well, today when we say innovation or we say technological innovation, we consider these two things almost synonyms, right? And this, I think, reflect not really a development, but rather an integration of neoclassical theories and neoclassical conceptualizations, right? Because at the end of the day, we are often we find references to neoclassical conceptualizations in central, influential innovation studies literature, right? I lost count how many times I found introduction to a chapter that starts pretty much like this. We know that innovation is the main driver of economic growth, and then there is a link, there is a reference to Solow, right? And sure, why not? Or something else in that direction, and that's no problem at all. But that's not Schumpeterian. Yeah, well, yeah, it's nice like that. So, and also it's funny because Schumpeter, as I said, was really seriously averse to economic growth, which he didn't consider a particularly relevant phenomenon. He was interested in explaining economic development. So there is an added irony in that. So I would say no, it's not consistent, but I'm open to as I said, I'm open to alternative viewpoints here.
Wait, so in a sneak preview for what's to come.
Yes.
In your opinion, because I have not sneak peeked yet, the technology is not an important driver to. Is technology an important driver to economic development for him, or no?
Yeah, but you see, it doesn't really work anymore, because you can say technology is an important driver of economic growth, but when you say technology is an important driver of economic development, it becomes problematic once you try to define exactly what you mean by economic development, because in a neoclassical perspective, then the change in technology would be economic development, and so you would have be mostly in a circular perspective. Now, what I would say is that essentially, for the Schumpeterian innovation, can take the form of technological innovation. Certainly, these are not separate concepts. At the same time, Schumpeterian innovation can very well often not take the form of technological innovation at all. So when you say to me, when someone say technological innovation, I understand a specific type of innovation, which is a subset. And my problem is that if you introduce that concept, I think that you have a specific conceptualization, a specific mechanism in mind, right? That applies only to technological innovation over all other kind of Schumpeterian innovation. But perhaps, usually after a while, I find out that simply we have different conceptualization of innovation. But I think this is a discussion that will really come up when Schumpeter finally introduces his definition of innovation, and then which superficially will look like exactly our own definition of innovation, but it is not. So there will be a fun discussion for that time, I think.
Well, with that, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was also wondering about the discussion in the chapter about the qualitative growth versus quantitative growth. So I thought that it was the technology and innovation was part of the qualitative growth that he was talking. Do you think that it is part of that or not?
Yeah. The qualitative, qualitative development or qualitative change, qualitative economic change that he calls economic development in other works, as I said, is essentially the general process of innovation, a subset of which is technological innovation. So yes, it is absolutely part of that.
But I found interesting that, as you mentioned, I think at the beginning, that this idea, neoclassical idea of economic growth that is much more based on GDP growth, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is more quantitative. So he's presenting here a little bit of another version of what is economic development. Do you know if any other writers that bring that in the sense of potential macro indicators to define what is economic development in other terms that other than GDP growth?
Yeah, good question. And the problem is that its own conceptualization of economic development defies or goes against the idea of an indicator, in a sense. So you would have essentially economic development would be visualized mostly by changes in economic parameters. If you think in macroeconomic terms, so it's and the changes in economic parameters can be pretty large in scope, and they can touch different economic parameters. Then, of course, he says that economic development is the form taken by the expansion of the system. Therefore, you can link this at the very end with economic growth, but there is not going to be any linear relationship. So you will not have a linear relationship between economic development and economic growth as measured by GDP, or what he calls here social product, because GDP was still to come. So people that do empirical work connected to this, I know people that have provided models of this, but it would be very difficult to find, an indicator of economic development, which I think is strictly tied with the problem that the field as a whole of innovation studies is facing when trying desperately to find an indicator of innovation, right? And something that works for that, and it is very difficult. And I think it really ties with the fact that we don't know, but we are building on a conceptualization that resists the idea of an indicator. Because over time, the indicator that, even if you could find an indicator for economic development, it would not be valid in the long term. And it is very difficult to figure out when it ceases to be valid and so forth. So, and all these things will probably come up in the future discussions. So I really hope you will be able to join also future discussions, because I am looking forward to the next discussion leaders to bring everything in this direction, which I think is very interesting.
Well, thank you for that. I think we ran out of time, unfortunately, but thank you for Beniamino for this excellent discussion and for your notes and leading our group today. The next meeting will be November 21st at 7 p.m. CET time. That's European time, Central European time. We'll discuss Chapter 2 with Dr. Yao Romero from the Federal University of Minas Gerais. I'm sorry, I cannot speak Portuguese at all. But we're looking forward to the second discussion, and I think we'll talk a little bit more in the next session about the differences of the translation, which will become more important in that chapter. If you have a moment to read the introduction by Schumpeter himself, he discusses actually a little bit of that discussion. It's only a couple of pages. And we're really looking forward to see you next time for the second part of our series. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. I hope next time you'll be able to participate a little bit more and be active with your questions and comments on November 21st. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.